Hello, everyone. Start with a quick drink of water. Welcome, good afternoon, and welcome to Smock Alley Theatre. And thank you all for coming to the Irish Theatre Institute's event as part of National Heritage Week, A Career in Parts, where we're going to have a conversation inspired by the Playography Archive. My name is Niamh Lunny. I worked in theatre mostly as a costume designer, but a full-time collaborator for nearly 20 years. I jokingly say that I defected to the heritage sector, but I'm now very happily working as CEO of an organisation called Irish Landmark Trust, and we look after heritage buildings and work in conservation architecture. So I'm delighted to be here today, metaphorically wearing my heritage and my theatre hats as your host for this conversation. And I'm going to ask a quick, unscripted, unsolicited question of the audience, if that's okay. As this is an event that is covering heritage and theatre, I wonder how many people are here because of their interest in theatre and how many people are here for their interest in heritage. Could I have a quick show of hands for theatre? That's what I thought. Anyone for heritage? Yay!
Or both.
Up the sector. So listen, as is customary, we'd like to start with a few thank yous. Firstly, thank you to the Heritage Council for funding this event as part of National Heritage Week. ITI is delighted to have received funding through the Community Heritage Scheme for the first time. This application was kindly supported by Charles Duggan, the Heritage Officer in Dublin County Council, and Dr. Barry Houlihan in the University of Galway and the Irish Landmark Trust. And of course, ITI is proud and grateful to be funded by the Arts Council. Thanks also to our host for the day, the brilliant team at Smock Alley. Thank you, everyone. And thank you to the equally brilliant people working across the event, including Jack Cawley and Arcade Films. Thanks, everyone. And of course, thank you to our panellists, our amazing panel who are here to join us today. And it is my pleasure to introduce them. So in no particular order, we have John King over here. John is a director and theatre maker. John works as part of Murmuration, which is a theatre collective making intimate headphone shows in public spaces around Dublin. Sinead Diskin is a sound designer and composer from Mayo. She's based in Dublin now, for her sins. She studied music in Trinity and is a graduate of the Rough Magic Seeds programme. And I cannot tell you how many times when I've been rehearsing this, I have said the Rough Seeds Magic programme, which I think also has potential. Dan Colley is an independent director and writer produced by Matt Smith and the Riverbanks Arts Centre. His play Lost Lear was nominated for Best New Play in the Irish Times Theatre Awards, and it goes on tour later this year. And finally, Pom Boyd succinctly describes herself as an actor, writer, comedian and environmental activist. Anyone familiar with her work could happily add several adjectives into that bio too. And on behalf of myself and the panellists, we'd like to thank Niamh O'Donnell and Catherine Murphy and everyone at ITI for inviting us to be part of this event today. So to help frame this conversation and give context to the discussion, I'm going to talk very briefly about heritage and playography. So heritage has such a vast scope. It comprises of tangible things like our historical sites, buildings, monuments, artefacts and archives. Also natural things like our waterways, landscapes, woodlands, bogs and native wildlife. And then the intangible things such as our customs, sports, music, dance, folklore, crafts, traditions and our theatre. These three types of heritage and all their associated myths, legends, traditions and memories provide us with a common language and insight that enables us to communicate on a deep level with each other and to express ourselves in a unique way to the outside world. National Heritage Week is an initiative of the Heritage Council, a public body, whose aim is to develop a wide understanding of the vital contribution that our heritage makes to our social, environmental and economic well-being. This year's theme, Living Heritage, invites you to explore the traditions and practices, knowledge and skills passed down through generations. It runs for 9 days from the 12th to the 20th of August. I know that's more than a week. There are more than 1,800 events taking place across the country, and it is expected that around 700,000 people will take part. And this makes National Heritage Week Ireland's biggest festival, which I actually think is a really exciting thing. There really is something for everyone. So if you haven't already, I'd encourage you to check out their website, which is heritageweek.ie. So heritage is not always a word we associate with theatre, and in my experience, it's not something practitioners are thinking about on a daily basis at all. Capturing the intangible heritage of creating ephemeral theatre experiences almost seems like a contradiction too far. But, and luckily for us, playography is tangible proof of theatre heritage in Ireland. Playography Ireland comprises 2 comprehensive searchable online databases: Irish Playography, which comprises all new professionally produced Irish plays written in English since the formation of the Abbey in 1904. That was the 100th anniversary. And written in Irish, all new plays, Playography na Gaeilge, I beg your pardon, all new plays written and produced in Irish since 1901. Irish playography started on a phased basis almost 22 years ago. Playography defined the Irish theatrical repertoire for the first time, but it also revitalised that repertoire by reintroducing many lost scripts and providing a gateway for locating and clearing rights for producing plays. This database has been updated on an ongoing basis until last year when, with initial funding from the Arts Council Capacity Building Scheme, it entered a period of rebuilding and transition. And this panel discussion today is taking place during this period of transition. ITI is delighted to say that updates on the database will be continued in the autumn, and there will also be new features coming to the website, including increased search functionality, and excitingly, Playography will start piloting the addition of images to a limited number of entries, deepening and enlivening the database and ensuring it becomes a resource for theatre makers now and into the future. So do keep an eye out for that, please. You may also have noticed there are copies of a publication called What is a Play throughout the space here. For the 20th anniversary of the database in 2001, ITI hosted an online symposium and launched a publication that asked writers about the current state of the play. Please feel free to take home a copy. There's also a QR code on the panel information sheet that links to a recording of the symposium. Make sure to check that out too. So, our heritage is what we have inherited from the past to value and enjoy in the present and pass on to future generations. But how does that really apply to theatre? And what is theatre heritage in Ireland anyway? And specifically for today's conversation, how do we understand our theatre heritage through the vehicle of playography? So this is going to be a conversation of 2 parts: what is captured by the archive and what is not captured by the archive. And I'm going to start with what's in there. So we know archives are important. They provide evidence of activities and tell us more about individuals and institutions. They tell stories, like we do in theatre every single day. They also serve to increase our sense of identity and understanding of cultures. So Pom, if I can start with you. If archives tell stories, what is the story of your career as told by the Playography archive?
Well, I feel I haven't looked at the playography for a while. I didn't look at my entry for a while until I was doing this. And so I looked at it a couple of days ago and I was shocked. I was like, is that it? Is that me? Is that me there on the page? So obviously it's not. It's not meant to be your life. It's not meant to be your entire creative experience. But for me, it tells a part of a story, and it tells parts of the story that I would rather weren't in there. I was shocked at some things that were in there. I was going, what the hell was I thinking? Putting that in. And then I started thinking about all the stuff that wasn't in there, that couldn't be, that I didn't think was valid. That's part of it. That's a huge part of it. And that didn't fit the play idea. Would now, but when I was back in the 1920s, didn't. But no, I'm talking about 1980s, which is when I started, 1981. And all my work was from my own creativity. we wrote it, I wrote what I needed to perform and performed it, and then it was gone. You know, it existed very ephemerally. And the value of it, the value of that, it's 6-7 years of work. There is no archive of it. There is no, it feels like when I talk about that time in my life that it kind of didn't happen. There's about 4 or 5 people I can talk to about it who will remember. And other than that, it doesn't exist. So that makes me sad, you know. And then there's, like, my show Shame is in my playography because that was a show. But I have another show that was a really important show that I did in 1992 that I didn't think was valid to put in there. So it's a mixed bag, and it kind of actually makes me feel a little bit sad.
Thanks.
Yeah.
John, if I can move along to you, what would be your take on that question? What's the story of your career as told by the...
So I suppose for me, because I moved away from university and lived overseas for 7 years and moved home to Ireland in 2019. The archive kind of conveniently doesn't include my sort of like first attempts at making theatre when I was out of college. So it maybe like gives a sort of a false sense of an origin point, I suppose. For me, like I sometimes feel like in the last 4 years since moving home, I felt a bit like a character in a sitcom who's like the cousin of the main character who arrives in season 5 and who they try to convince you has been here the whole time. And I think the archive kind of reflects that feeling a little bit. Like there's stuff that I made maybe when I was starting out that like, yeah, first couple of years that sort of isn't there. And like the first entry there is the kind of, I was still living away and came back to make this show at Fringe, and it's sort of the first time I think I made something that I really, like I was really proud of. I knew, I figured out, I suppose, like what kind of work I wanted to make through it, so that it's the first entry is like lovely, but also maybe not entirely, not an entirely accurate reflection, I suppose, of an origin point, if that makes sense.
That does make sense. And I suppose, you know, we have to note that the archive is only recording new pieces, so it's not a CV. So I wonder how you feel it reflects your arc, Sinead, or the story of your career.
Yeah, I think I agree with the guys. I when I looked at it, I hadn't looked at it in a long time, and when I looked at it recently, I was surprised at the earlier stuff, and then basically I felt like there was huge gaps. So I thought, oh wow, it doesn't kind of reflect how I got from A to B, and all the bits in between that actually enabled me to get to certain points of shows that were there. So, and I think as well, I hadn't thought about, like, we'll say, devised work that's not there, because and where does that sit, and things like that I would have really felt I learned a huge amount from, and felt like it's a real turning point in my career, and those ones were like the real catalysts, but they're not there. So yeah, I think it's representative of certain points, but the gaps I feel are quite evident.
Okay, thanks. Dan, what's the story of your career as told by your entry?
I think, yeah, like as you say, I suppose it's just the touch points at which your career has touched new pieces of work that are considered plays, I suppose. So the absence is not necessarily all that surprising, but when you do see it like that, one of the things I reflect on is basically all of the roles I've kind of moved between. I mean, the thing that really shocked me when I saw it there was, oh my God, that play I was in the Peacock when I was 18, you know? I was like an actor, you know, an actor in those days. And to see that, obviously that was a new piece of work. It was a new play by Nicholas Kelley. And then to see, I suppose, the various different credits that were sort of conjured along the way. You know, it's, at one point I realised, I started calling myself a dramaturg. And I guess it reminded me of what that was like, going around town telling people that that's what you were without really knowing what it was, but also mostly betting that they didn't know what it was. And then eventually sort of like what the bulk of the entry is seeing, you know, writer, co-director of a bunch of new things. also, I suppose, noticing the different collaborators that go along with that. So very often if I take a writing credit, it's also with the cast, and sometimes the cast is named or whatever that is. It's in sort of recognition of the kind of way in which I work, which is that I start without writing, and that I set up the sort of circumstances for people to improvise, and then we share credits at the end. But in an entry like this, you can see all the people and the different phases that you've gone along with. So for me, it shows that arc of a kind of a career from performer through dramaturg to somebody who's doing writing stuff.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
And Pam, I want to go back to something you said maybe a little bit later in terms of what's not in there. But what does it mean to be in there? What does it mean to be part of an archive?
Oh, well, it's great. You know, it's a recognition of your work, and it's a validation. So that is fantastic. And I remember when ITI was starting it, that suddenly you kind of go, I'm going to be, my work's going to be in there, you know. So yes, it's a validation, and that's a good thing, you know, and it's good. But there are things in it that I would like to take out. Doesn't feel quite so good, you know. So it's.
Do you want to say a little bit more about that?
Well, for some reason, there's two shows in there that were so insignificant. I think what happened at some stage when I was passing my info over to Siobhan, and I can't remember, it's all a blur anyway, like my entire life, but I do remember I had a period in my life which went quiet. It went quiet to the theatre world. It wasn't obviously quiet to me, and my work was not in the centre. It moved, and it had always been on the fringes anyway. I had always been outside of the main, if you take the main as the Abbey and the Gate and, you know, that, then there was a sort of second stage, I suppose, that Rough Magic would have, you know, that was another tier outside of that, and then there was tiers beyond that. But I feel I started way out, which is where I wanted to be. But yeah, so I've completely lost my train of thought. What would...
It was just about being part of the archive, but your specific things that were in there that you.
Oh yeah, what I was talking about when my life went quiet, but I was still working. I was doing theatre I was working with drug users. I made an entire theatre show with drug users, you know, which is one of the favourite things that I've done in my career. But so it went quiet, and I think when I was trying to establish myself again, I was trying to legitimise myself by saying, oh, what piece of new, oh, this is this piece and this piece and this piece. And there's pieces in there by other people as an actor that I put in because they were new writing, but they were dreadful. You know, they were dreadful experiences, and they shouldn't be there. And so when I see them, I'm just going, what the hell? But for me, you know, I think Catherine said that the archive can be kind of dry, just as an archive. But when you're reading it, you have all the experience that you're looking at it with. So you bring all those feelings with it as well, and that's what you do. You know, your shame and your like what I just said. You know,
Yeah.
why is that there?
I think historians might argue that it should all be in there, regardless of the experience, good or bad.
Well, yeah.
But
As long as everything's there. But if that's there, and then really important stuff that's of value to you isn't there, then you're left with this, like, what's going on here, you know, how is this representing me?
Yeah. And John, what about for you? Because you're someone who's newer to the archive, so to speak. And I think for all of us, you know, none of us are necessarily considering the archive when we're, and no disrespect to the archive, but when we're involved in or making or creating work, it's not our, you know, the first thing that we're thinking about. But what does it mean to you to be part of an archive?
I suppose it's just lovely to kind of feel included, maybe, or to feel part of something, especially if, like, you spent a while feeling like you've been peering through the window, being like, oh, I'd love to be part of something. So that, it is kind of like legitimizing, I suppose, like, Pam said. And I always think like the ephemerality of theatre is maybe what makes it special too, and that can feel very forgiving or something. The fact that, like, your best things and your worst things soon will exist in memory, and then just as a series of impressions in the minds of a couple of people. And I really like that kind of clean slate. Like, unlike, say, sculptors or architects, we don't have to drive past the thing that we made and like live with our creative decisions every day. And I think that's why I have no tattoos. Like, I wouldn't want to look at something fixed for a long time. So maybe there's something. Yeah, I think that there can be something like kind of forgiving and hopeful, because, like, I don't know, like with theatres, maybe like life, and with like romantic relationships as well, you kind of go into them knowing they're certain to end in some way, but you still have to like believe you can find meaning in them and that they're worth investing in, even though like we know it's going to finish and we know the end is coming. Which, yeah, there's a kind of a perverse kind of hope in there, maybe. And and then I think that, yeah, and then as a counter to that, maybe like the archive ensures that like there's some kind of like record of it, even if we sort of aren't trying to capture the totality of something, because I think the finiteness of it is, to me at least, is part of what makes it special, I think.
Great, thank you. And Sinead, for you to be part of the archive, particularly I think as a sound designer, it's an interesting concept.
I think I completely agree. It definitely legitimizes it. And it feels like you're part of a community, because like that, you can't capture the sound, but you're there. So you exist. Yeah. And also, I think a lot of the time, just the nature of our work, you're constantly looking ahead. You're constantly looking for the next show, what's coming up. And you don't really pause and reflect. Or if you do, it's on like the more difficult ones. And that was a hard one. And you don't think of the nice ones very often or get to talk about them. So when you look at the archive, and you get to remember and have the perspective of those, which I don't think we would have without the archive a lot of the time. So yeah, I think there's huge benefits to it. And yeah, it just feels lovely to be part of.
Great. And Dan, anything different for you in there?
No. No, it feels good. And also there's that sense in which it's, I mean, my experience is a bit different to Palm's in that I wasn't there at the beginning of it. So I didn't supply the information that started. My entry kind of grew, sort of it appeared online at some point. Somebody had kind of taken my credits and sort of put them together and taken the plays and parsed them out into this archive. So there's that sense in which so much of what you're doing feels so auto-generative. You're kind of pushing up a hill a lot of the time, and then every so often you get an opportunity like that, like a review that you didn't have to hound a PR, to hound a journalist to come in and see, appears, and it has some real authentic engagement with what it is, and you go, it existed. And I didn't have to will that particular thing into existence either. So I think the playography in the archive does that. It captures it because at some point somebody said this matters.
Okay, great. I'm going to stay with you then, Dan, for a second. You've kind of touched on it there, but what do you think then, I suppose, is the culture of Irish theatre as told through your entry in playography, or playography in general?
Yeah, well, it's interesting in that it's deliberately selective, right? It's new work and it's new plays for the most part, and we know the things that it's kind of leaving out, I suppose, and so it doesn't, I think, tell the culture. It doesn't tell doesn't give a complete picture of the culture of Irish theatre. I don't think it's trying to do that, and I think back on the way in which we try and credit these things. I remember when the Company, do you remember the Company? Jurgen Harsign and Jose Miguel Jimenez and Brian Bennett and those guys. It was the first time that a sort of a piece of work, I think from the Fringe, was kind of in the Peacock. It had been remounted in the Peacock. And at the time, the Abbey had this like format of poster where it said playwright name of play, and that was what they all did. And the first iteration of that poster for when they were going to remount this devised piece of work was As You Are Now, So Once Were We, title of the play, with Jose Miguel Jimenez, the title of the playwright. just in that format. But he wasn't the playwright. He was just one of the people who created it. He was the director. And they had to reformat it or whatever. And so I think it's a small thing, but it's a kind of a visual interpretation of almost like the kind of wedge that was trying to fit into a space that hadn't quite created the format of it. And I think that the playography is doing that in the way that it tries to capture the various nuances of the different titles that are going on, but it's always going to capture something that is always going to sort of necessarily fail, you know? And people like us will come along and go, that's a bit different, but it's different in an interesting way because when you propose something, we're always going to see the anti-proposition, right? If you propose that there is such a thing as a co-director, well, then all of a sudden we see the thing that doesn't name, I suppose. So I feel like it's a living thing that'll continue to reflect the nuances imperfectly. You know, there'll always be a format. You have to hyperlink something.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Right. Can I circle back to Pom then? Because Pom, you mentioned feeling outside of the mainstream, not feeling, of being.
Yeah.
It's not a feeling, of being outside the mainstream. So
Yeah.
what then, in your view, is the culture of Irish theatre as told by your entry in playography?
I think what Dan has said really articulates so much of it. But in terms of the culture, I feel I was part of, when I started back in the 80s, I started in a place called the Grapevine Arts Centre, which is up on North Frederick Street. And that was where I cut my creative teeth and you know, learned so much, and it was so free. But it also had a political, not agenda, but it was very left wing. So it was a kind of a hub of activity, and a lot of the performances would be for benefits for the Rape Crisis Centre or the amendment campaign or different campaigns that were going on back then. So there was a very strong political thing. And this came up with the Waking the Feminist, at the time of Waking the Feminists as well, this came up, which was like, you know, an explosion in my head when I suddenly realised about how to go into theatre, whereas all this stuff that I was doing was performance, and it was theatre, it took place in theatres, but it took place in the street, it was very immediate, it took place, you know, it was very real. There was no fourth wall at all in most of the stuff. And then when I moved into theatre and started, you know, doing shows, I used to feel like I'd gone back to school or something. I found it very hierarchical, and I hated the structure, but that was theatre. And if you wanted to do theatre, that's what you had to do. So you parked everything else at the door. You know, you parked your politics, you parked your feelings about, you know, the hierarchical structure and all of that. So I suppose I always went to the outside because I wasn't comfortable with the inside. But then the inside didn't want me either, because it recognised, I think, very quickly, and does recognise very quickly, you know, like all institutions, what they want and what they don't want and what there's room for. And there certainly wasn't room for someone who was creative, opinionated, and a woman, and had ideas, you know, and was a threat to the sort of, at that time, very established male hierarchy.
I think there's a lot of people here can recognise a lot of
Yeah.
what you're talking about.
Yeah.
I'm wondering then, when you reflect on your career in theatre, or as told again by the playography archive, Pom, what are the highlights for you that exist in there? Where do you see moments of transition within that?
There's two very clear ones. One is Down Onto Blue, my first play, proper play, which Siobhan Burke Siobhan is sick of hearing me saying this, but because every time I talk about it, but it's so true. She was the first person to validate me as a writer. I'd been writing all the time, but I never saw myself as a writer. But Siobhan commissioned a play from me, so that was huge. And Down Onto Blue was a success and went on in the project. And so that's a huge moment I can see in the arc there. And then the other one is my own show, Shame, which I don't know, 20 years later, you know, but that was sort of a naming of all this stuff that we're talking about, and my mother's performing career, where I was pulling together a whole load of threads that would have started in Down Onto Blue, but that was the fictional sort of, not, you know, my life part of it, as with all us writers, went into that, but a small bit. But Shame was was bearing it all. So they're two very key moments in my performing career and as a writer and as a creator and everything.
Great.
So, and they'd be just two that I'd be proud of, you know,
Yeah.
that I would always put in.
And John, what about you? What do you feel are your standout moments from your entry as it exists? And also just noting that, you know, your entry is smaller at the moment because you were away. You know, does that make it harder to pick, or can you still see a sort of highlights and an arc in there?
I suppose so, yeah. I would say like that first entry that I mentioned before, Summertime, was like, we had such a great time making that, and that like art making feeling of joy where you just feel really like filled up by what everyone is doing, and you're kind of, all of the collaborators are creatively kind of falling in love with each other, and everyone's really proud of the work that they're doing. And so that one, and as I said, I was living away still at the time, and we were so looked after, like Fringe would give us rehearsal space. I think Dead Centre gave us headphones, like loaned us headphones for the performance. Fringe found the performance space for us, which had some like kind of specific requirements, and I'd never like experienced that level of care or like investment before, and so much so that when the job I was doing in Washington DC at the time finished, I moved back to Dublin to kind of try and keep chasing that feeling, I guess, or to try and keep working with that group, which has happened. So we've made 4 shows now, and so that was, in terms of transition, that was like a huge, it's kind of like a lighthouse turning on in the distance, and that sort of made me at least sort of change the direction of the boat a little bit. And then the other one would be our second, in terms of process, the second show that we made, my second show in the playography, Will I See You There, was a show where the process, we had our first week on it in March 2020, and so we had already it had already pivoted in terms of how we were going to make it. It was going to start as a text-led piece with a written text provided by a playwright we were working with, and then kind of, you know, life got in the way and we pivoted towards a devised process. And so we had a week I was kind of faced with a week with an empty rehearsal room with all of our collaborators there and no text, which I'd never really encountered as a theatre director before. And it was the first time I really had to like think about, I suppose, like providing a process or putting a shape on like 5 days when there maybe isn't a shared foundation that we're going, like trying to create a foundation, I suppose, as a director. And it's the point where I maybe started using the word theatre maker after that, and where when you're asked to write about your process, or when you're asked in applications to write about your, like an artistic statement, everything before then felt a little bit hypothetical. And that week of devising created a really concrete map of like, oh, this is how I make work, or this is how I face the sort of like unknown 5 days, empty rehearsal room. How do we put a shape on it, I suppose? So that was a real, it's still been kind of the blueprint for everything I've made since, I think.
Thank you. Sinead, what do you think when you look? Are there any specific standout moments for you, you know, or
definitely.
transitions? And I also want to ask a double question, because when we were backstage, we were just talking about the culture question and who might want to answer it and who might not. And initially, I thought, this is really interesting. Sinead kind of said, I'm not sure I have too much to say about culture. And then actually, when you thought about it for a while, you had something really interesting to say about it. So I'd love you to tell us a bit more about that as well.
Yeah, initially I was like, I don't know how that applies. And then when I was thinking about it, I realised I finished Seeds at end of 2017. So 2016, 2017, for the whole of Waking the Feminist kicking off, I was in Seeds, and then it finished. And so I think there was maybe one other female sound designer. It was Alma Kelleher, who I lived with in college. So it was me and Alma trying to figure things out. Well, Alma had a brilliant career, and she was teaching me all the ropes. But that was it. And when I think back now, I think, God, I was so naive. But I feel like everything happened at the exact right time, because people were actively looking for women to design shows, and I was ready to go. So it really aligned, like completely nothing to do with me, but just the timing was so brilliant. But when I think back now, you know, had it not been that time, I really don't think, like, I think it would have been a completely different career without doubt, you know, because the first show, like the biggest kind of opportunity I got was straight out of Seeds. I did The Snapper in the Gate, and that just put me on a completely different trajectory. But that definitely came from Waking the Feminists and people actively looking, especially for female sound designers, because we apparently didn't exist, you know. So, they took a huge risk, you know. I was young and inexperienced, well, not too young, but inexperienced. And so that was a big one. And it was huge pressure and brilliant fun and an excellent time with brilliant collaborators. So it definitely set me on a different track. So yeah, I think that that's the initial kind of big one. And then the other highlight is Walking with Ghosts with Gabriel Byrne, and the journey that kind of took us all on, and ending up going to Broadway with that was amazing and a real just gorgeous experience, and something I feel like everybody kind of got to celebrate. There was huge pride around it. And even for my family who are not in theatre at all, they were like, okay, we know what Broadway is. So that's good, yes? I'm like, yes, you know, so everybody could kind of get something from that.
Yeah.
And it also kind of, you know, it was like, oh, tech is tech, no matter where you are. So it felt like, oh, things are a lot more accessible than they may appear. And, you know, the bigger stages are actually, it's just another stage in another theatre. And, you know, if we can do it anywhere here, we can do it there. It's not, the leap isn't actually as big in reality as it may feel. And that was brilliant to experience, and to come back here to go, you know, we're doing pretty great here, and the stuff we're making is pretty good, and we should be really proud of ourselves.
I think that's amazing. I feel like there couldn't be a bigger contradiction between your definition, or not definition, but your experience of theatre culture and your experience of theatre culture.
Yeah.
If we tried. So, but it's actually really heartening to hear both stories side by side as well. It's amazing. I know we've talked a little bit about credits within playography and how we're credited with different things. And I suppose as a former costume designer, I have some experience of that myself, in how the naming of things changes and what it means. So when I look at my early entries on doing costumes, I was laughing about this earlier, going, what does that even mean? What costumes? Was I the costumes? And then I become a designer, and then it sort of morphs into other things as well. And I know for some people that's a transition in their career, and in some cases it's maybe it's a fashion around what we call ourselves, or the nomenclature of the time, in terms of whether we're making theatre or we're, you know, doing something else, writing theatre or whatever. What's your experience of that, Dan?
Well, I mean, I mentioned I left college and I was like, I'm going to be a dramaturg, you know, with very little experience of what that was. I had a really good experience sitting around a table with a new script that needed a bit of work and had a bit of funding from it that Andrew Flynn had got to work on this play, and I was in there as an actor, and I thought, God, I could do this all day, right? I could do the processing of it. Never mind getting to rehearsals, I could do the processing of it. I don't know where I got the word dramaturg from. I can't remember the first time I heard it, but I remember talking to Thomas Conway, who I think might have still been literary manager of Druid before. He might have to correct me on that, but I think there was a point at which certainly Gavin Costick, anyway, in Fishamble was literary manager and then dramaturg. I believe there was that transition. And I remember kind of going around sort of saying, like, well, what do you think dramaturgy is?
Take a vote.
Thomas was very generous, but he said something like, it's like a critic who's on your side. And if there's any critics in the room, I'm sure the good ones will say they are on your side. But then why do they publish their notes? So that was a word that I remember having to have that conversation with a lot of people, and it was an interesting and productive conversation. And I was just out of college, and I was just getting back in touch with my old youth theatre and putting together plays in a basement that somebody had the keys to or whatever. And I was like, I'm a dramaturg, by the way, guys. And they were like, yep, cool. And then that got me into, I suppose, other people's rooms in an interesting way. And I discovered through that I suppose what I did want to do actually was sort of lead creatively, maybe engage dramaturgs as part of the creative process. But that's my sort of reflection on the sort of the title, how the title was changing, but also how my role was changing.
Your career was progressing.
Career was progressing, and into that theatre culture thing, I suppose. It was 2009, 10, 11, 12 when I graduated from college and was around that and was calling myself a dramaturg. We were sort of, generally speaking, moving away from the sort of centrality of the playwright as the sort of sole author of the piece of work towards things that were more collaborative or maybe relied on testimony, documentary or whatever. And so into that space, the word dramaturg seemed to be more applicable than critic who's on your side or whatever it might be.
That's great. And I'm going to circle back to Palm because, I mean, Palm, there's nothing we haven't called you.
Oh my God, I'll try and keep this brief, but I'll just go through the titles, so I was just thinking about it there. I'd forgotten about this. When I started in 1981 up in the Grapevine, and it was comedy, but we were clowns, so everyone was trying to be, and there was a purity to it. It was, it wasn't Ronald McDonald or anything like, there was a real finding your clown, and I know people like Raymond Keane have kept that very true and taken that whole clown journey. But anyway, so it was clown. Clown never really sat that well with me, but I was a clown, and then I was a street performer. And now if you say street performer, I'm always a bit ashamed to say street performer. And when I think of the stuff I did on the street, it's so brave, and the experiences, and now it would be called site-specific performance, but we called it street theatre. And it was original and really rough, because you had nothing between you and the audience, and you were getting your hair pulled, or, and then it was, the time of Tom McGinty, and we were doing stillness, so you would literally be so vulnerable standing on the street, staying still for hours. But anyway, so we went clown, street performer, to actress. And, actress, I was actress for a very long time, and then suddenly I'm not an actress, I'm an actor. So, and then there was the conflict between when I came back from New York and I'd done all my Grapevine comedy years here, there was a whole new scene, and that was the stand-up comedy scene. So was I a stand-up? And I always felt such a fraud calling myself a stand-up, but I was being wedged into the stand-up arena. I wasn't a stand-up, I was never a stand-up, so I was a comic actor. So am I a comic actor? Oh no, you're a performer. I'm a performer. So I often call myself a performer. And then, so there's actress. I was an actress, now I'm an actor. Back then, I remember when I was an actress having reviews that said Miss Palm Boyd, Miss P. Boyd. So it does reflect the culture and the fashion and the politics and all of that. It's interesting, just when you just look at titles.
Great.
You could do a whole thing about that.
Thank you so much. I'm going to change track slightly now, because we know the archive is such a valuable tool, but as we've already said, theatre is fleeting, immediate, visceral, multisensory and critically live. So, capturing the intangible heritage of ephemeral theatre moments is, as we've said, kind of a contradiction. So I'm wondering, firstly, what cannot be captured by the archive, and, if anything, what should we do about that? But also for the audience here today, we have the power to fill in some of those gaps, right? So if you could tell them something about something in your entry that is not obviously part of the entry, what would it be? This is the opportunity to get the real juice.
That's not in there. Well, I mentioned this in the green room. Fanula Gigax, a theatre maker and friend, marvellous person, has this great idea. I hope it's okay that I'm telling you about it, but I should have asked her. But she wants to put a bit on her website, which is the graveyard. All the bits that didn't make it, right? All the things that didn't have, that didn't get the funding, that had maybe a work in progress, that was an idea you developed and you shopped around for a while, and then eventually you put it in the graveyard. And I just think that's such a good idea. There's so many of those. And they are part of your story, right? They are part of your development as an artist. You are working on them. And just because they don't get to see like a paying audience or whatever, doesn't mean that they're not part of it, Mm-hmm. I almost think of like you know, if we lived in a slightly less like ticket in exchange for art sort of culture and economy, we could be more like Grotowski. You know, Grotowski's entry would have nothing in it. He just rehearsed for years, years. He never showed it to anybody. In a woods somewhere, you know. So yeah, I think there's something kind of not quite captured by that. So yeah, the thing I would like to tell people about was Dance Macabre. Which is a street performance, right? That I did with Mockness. That was sort of not quite there. It doesn't sort of fit the criteria for the playography, but it was in turn sort of inspired by Dance Plague, a play that I did like as a kind of a work in progress in the Dublin Theatre Festival, but just didn't get the funding. It was just something I worked on for years and years and years, and then it transformed into something else. It transformed into a big street performance when in fact it was going to be a narrative about people in a school or whatever. So it's those sort of the bits that fall down the side of the couch, I suppose. Juicy crumbs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sinead, what are the stories that you'd like people to hear?
I'd love there to be more about process and about what collaboration is and what it means for designers with writers and with directors, and you know, just more about what it takes, like in the room, and how fun it is and how special it can be to be in there and getting it all together. And I'd love, like I've worked with you on Torch with the New, which is this gorgeous devised piece we did in St. Helens outside Manchester, and those kind of ones I think are just so incredibly special and so difficult to articulate what it is about it that made it great and made the work great. So I'd love us to be able to figure out a way to in some way capture or articulate how special the collaboration can be on those projects, and that's why we're all doing it, really. You know, I can't exist by myself. So I can't just do sound design here and everybody comes and like I need all of everybody together, and it's so that's the most thing about process and collaboration. I think if there was a way we could showcase it or talk about it more or represent it, I think it'd be great.
And just leading on from that, then how would you articulate the collaborative process, maybe as it happened on that show, or a different one from your...
On that show in particular, we just were all in the room so much, and everything, I think it's the most collaborative show I think I've ever worked on. It very, very quickly from the get-go, everybody's voice was valid. So everybody could have an opinion, everybody could share an opinion, nothing was wrong. Everybody was throwing stuff at it, and that was completely encouraged all of the time. And, you know, it makes you braver, and it makes you kind of actually push yourself and push each other in a way that I had never experienced before. And it just means that you get the best out of each other and the best out of the work. And we also were having a great time. So, but it had this real, just complete collaboration in a way that I hadn't experienced, and I think we got the best out of it because of that. And it was basically in a house. Most of the play was in a house on a street in St. Helens, and we were in that house so much, and we just became like almost like we were living there in a little cult in this place. And yeah, I think it's having the space and having the time and having the trust, and also the challenge and the pushing, the gentle pushing from people to go, you know, come on, what else have you got? Which was just brilliant. So that one was very special.
The dramaturg.
The dramaturg, exactly.
Now that I finally understand what that means. John, for you, what are the stories that you'd love to tell people that can't be told by the archive, basically?
I suppose very similar stuff. It's like, for me, maybe the tangents that arise in a room or that come out of the improvisations, that like the bits that aren't going to be part of the show, or the like silliness that like is really important for generating the work, but then it doesn't quite make its way into the work. When we've made work with Murmuration, we as our debrief, we talk about like our white rabbits, so like the things that we didn't get to, you know, chase down a rabbit hole partway through, that we had to park, and then we've tried to use those as the basis for our next show. So the shows have kind of grown out of each other, based on like those kind of impulses. And actually, part of that is or where that came from was that, because it's all headphone work, there's a lot of testing levels, and Jenny O'Malley, our brilliant composer designer, she actually has recorded all of the mic tests that the actors have done, and in 3 instances has made remixes from them. So she has set them to a beat, and it's just actors riffing into the microphones like we did earlier, and they're really good. And you totally forget the like just the weird voices or just like nonsense that comes out of people's mouths while they're wearing microphones. So on a Google Drive, we do have 3 Jenny O'Malley remixes that will never see the light of day, but are just like very trippy and very fun to listen to, and are great bops as well.
Brilliant. I no longer work in theatre, as I've said, but I still walk down the street every day to and from work. And a lot of mornings they're warming up in the Gaiety School of Acting when I walk by. And it is like music for my soul. I'm like, oh, my people. So I think I know what you're talking about. Pom, what about for you? What are the stories you wish you could tell people? In fact, you can tell them if you wish. What do you think people should know?
Well, I wouldn't know where to begin with that, to be honest with you. And I'd be scared to start because I realise time is limited and it's going to happen all day. But what I would just like to say, though, is, no, honestly, there's so many stories, you know, when you start thinking about, you know, all your experiences in theatre, like, there's so many. I just would be boring the legs off everyone. But I think, seeing as we're talking about heritage as well, and you know, I'm passionate about heritage, and I don't think that's reflected in the playography at all. But buildings, built heritage is one of my biggest passions, you know, and so much of my Dublin history, my performing history and all of that is tied up with place, you know, and places that you see disappearing and how Dublin is changing. So it's so personal, you know, when you've lived in the city as long as I have and literally performed on the street or in buildings that are no longer existing, or, you know, the Grapevine, which was at the top of North Frederick Street. And so I think in terms of why I think this is so interesting is that the link with the heritage and some built heritage, which is not ephemeral until it's demolished or destroyed, which is happening to a lot of it, and then something very ephemeral that took place in those buildings. You know, it's I just find that in itself as an idea there's so much, so it's so rich. And it's full for me with such sadness as well, because it's or melancholy is a better word, not sadness. Everything isn't sad, but you know, time passing, change, things that have disappeared, things that will. How can you explain a past to somebody that didn't live it? You know, none of us can explain our lives to somebody else and our lived lives. You know, so there's an acceptance. There has to be an acceptance of just letting stuff go. It's gone. It doesn't matter. It's like, you know, the Zen artist, Buddhist artist, painting their intricate paintings and then letting the water wash it away. So I often console myself with that when I do kind of go, Jesus, all this stuff, my kids don't know about it, you know, they don't want to hear my stories. So you have to just kind of just go, that was, and it's all part of the ether, I suppose, of Dublin, and that's...
Could I, because one thing that struck me while you were speaking there, Pom, was just how important it is. This happens in theatre, and it also happens a lot in kind of queer communities as well, is mentorship and that sort of passing on across generations of understandings of culture, and just how important those kind of people who've been like a generation or two ahead of me in the community have been in sort of shaping my understanding and sort of, you know, at times filling out the kind of you know, sort of challenging the sort of idea that anything I'm thinking of is new, you know.
Yeah.
But also like the good ones will let you, you know, like will, you know, that sort of with that kind of generosity of community, those mentors will also like allow you to make that, to work on that assumption that these things are new as well, and you will find something new in it.
Yeah,
because it's you,
absolutely.
you know. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's an oral history, I suppose. I kind of.
Yeah. I was thinking that earlier. Yeah. So much of it is an oral tradition, which is so Irish as well, you know, so much part of our tradition. And to see it as that, I suppose. I mean, I'm just sad that there weren't phones and videos and, you know, maybe. I don't know. I'm not sad that I didn't grow up with mobile phones. Absolutely not. But but that there's no record. Like I spent 5 formative years in the Grapevine Arts Centre, but I was never there the day the photographs were taken for some reason. And the same with my school education. You would not know I went to the school that I went to because, of course, I was absent every day the photos were taken. So there's no record, absolutely none, of this part of my life that was so huge and that I gave to and gave to me. So, but yeah, I think you just have to just say, well, that's the way it is. What does it matter really?
Do you have a desire to like make the record of it yourself?
Yes, I do. I do. Very much.
And that kind of leads me to another question, which is, if we're talking about mentorship, which you've mentioned, which you're absolutely right, is huge in this industry, mentorship and direction and passing things on, how do we, or how would you like your story to be told by an archive in the future? Or how would you even approach that? Any ideas about that, Paul?
Yeah, I don't know if that could ever be. If, do you know, an archive will tell certain things, but as myself, it'll never be the story. But it will certainly, you know, yeah, I made my contribution along with everybody else, you know, so that'll be there. That's a good thing. But for me, it tells so little of the story, and the story of Dublin, I feel, that it won't be enough. But I feel, Catherine was talking about, you know, how the playography might expand a little bit. I mean, it's an impossible task, but possibly there are other ways to fill it out a bit more, to add in a bit more of the colour of the stories. Maybe people can put in their favourite anecdotes or something, I don't know. But yeah.
And John, what about for you? How would you like your archive to be? And
I suppose the
what would you like people to get from it? What would you like them to understand from it?
I think actually it's probably more process than product. Like a list of shows is whatever, but actually like a sense that like we all got together in an empty room, we all like brought in our ideas, the sort of like the story of the making, I think. My granddad worked for Guinness's but he played the double bass as well. And I remember like my first experience of theatre was going to see him play with the Rathmines and Rathgar Musical Theatre Society. And I remember like my first memory of theatre is we'd get the programmes would have like a black and white photo from the rehearsal hall in it of like people that you have just seen on stage but wearing like tracksuit bottoms and runners. And my memory is wanting to be in the photograph rather than wanting to be on the stage. I have a really clear memory of being like I felt like the musical was like we were just getting the end result of like there was a big secret that they all had that we weren't in on. And so I suppose I'm more interested, what happened in the room, I think, is the thing that I'd like to, and I've made no effort to try and capture actually, but maybe should think about.
Thank you. Sinead, same question to you.
It's the same as John. The process for me is the best part. You know, I love being in the rehearsal room, which is really difficult actually, because I obviously can't make the sounds when I'm there, so I really have to be strict with myself. But I just love seeing how decisions are made and where, you know, what's been thrown away, why it's come to this decision. And it's so fun and it's so alive, and it's why we're all doing it. So if we could somehow capture that energy or what it means to be there and how that process works, that would be the thing. But I do love hearing people talk about shows and talk about experiences they've had in their own voice, you know, telling the story of it. You know, you could read a play or you can go to see it or look at the production shots or whatever, but when you hear somebody talk about their own experience of this great show they were part of, it's magical, you know, and it really makes you want to be working with them again. You're like, I want to work with you. You know, that sounds fantastic. So I think there's something really powerful about hearing people talk about their own experiences in their own voices that I'd love to capture.
It's beautiful. Goosebumps. Folks, we are nearly at the end of our time, if my watch is telling me the truth. But we do have time for a few questions if anybody in the audience wanted to ask anything, having listened to that conversation. The only thing I'd ask is if you want to ask a question, put up your hand and we'll get a roving mic to you so that we can hear you. Does anybody have anything that they'd like to? We've got a question up here. If we can get a mic up here, that'd be great.
I don't like these things. I'm not a performer. I work in corporate. Thank you for that. That was absolutely fantastic. I haven't been to one of these events before, so I really enjoy it. And I am a thespian, absolutely love theatre and drama and everything related to creativity, because I am not one of them. But I'm very interested. I've actually Googled you all now, and I'm very and I'm very interested to know actually what you guys have coming up next.
Great. Dan, do you want to start? Because you've got a show.
Sure, I've got a show coming.
Ready.
Tickets are on sale. Lost Lear is the next thing I've got coming up, which is a remount of a show I made last year, and it is a sort of a version of King Lear in which the main character is playing King Lear in a rehearsal, and it gradually emerges that she's actually part of dementia care practice in which she's being kept in a happy, safe memory, and things go awry when her estranged son arrives into this and tries to insert himself into the practice. And that is going to be on tour in October through November, and it's doing about 3 or 4 venues around Dublin, including the Project Art Centre, and then around the country. Tickets on sale now, tell your friends.
Brilliant.
Sinead, what are you working on at the moment?
We have just started week 1 rehearsals in the Abbey for the Dublin Theatre Festival show Somewhere Out There You by Nancy Harris, directed by Wayne Jordan. I do not know the dates, but if you look it up on the Abbey website, they're there. It's kind of a rom-com. It's hilarious and so fun. So definitely book the tickets and come along.
Great. John, what's in the pipeline?
Well, we have a show called One Moment Now. That was Bewley's commission. It's currently running in Washington, D.C. It's a headphone show for one audience member, and it's kind of instruction-based. And so there is a live element, but there are no live performers, and that will hopefully be coming back if you keep an eye out for it. But that's all I'll say for now.
Pom?
I am going to be in a show in the Theatre Festival in a couple of weeks, months. Give me a second. I know it's a new play by In Two Minds. Thank you very much. In Two Minds by Joanne Ryan, and it's that's going to be on in soon.
I just want to thank the audience member for that question, because as theatre makers, you actually couldn't ask for a better question to be asked.
Yeah.
Here's a chance to.
Brilliant.
Fantastic, thank you. Is there anybody else out there who has a question? Yeah, we've one over here. Thanks, Kate.
Just, I suppose, some have mentioned having been to college, and I'm in college at the moment, and I'm wondering how college prepares you for the real world of theatre making. Yeah.
Like to
That's a
take
very
that?
interesting question.
Yeah, it's a great question.
Yeah, it's a brilliant question. I never went to college. And it comes up now. There was no college when I was starting out for theatre. You know, it was an impossible. It was this thing that you had to try and figure out where the door into it was. So I didn't go to college, but I've. So I can't answer how college prepares you. I don't have no experience of formal college.
I did go to college, but I didn't study theatre. I did English and just used the time to grow up a bit. And then most of my kind of practice training came from youth theatre facilitation. So I worked with the National Association of Youth Drama, now Youth Theatre Ireland, and that's where I picked up what became directing skills. And then I learned a lot by teaching, including with you, Maureen. that's where you do most of your learning in college by teaching in college. That's how I found, yeah.
I did music in college, so I think there's parts of it that did help, but I think, and like a lot of the kind of basic skills that I need for making the sounds and stuff. I did get there, but it was, you know, it changes so much. Like even technologically, what we were using back then, we don't use anymore. The recording place in Trinity wasn't soundproof, so we'd have to stop every time the campanile went off and try and time it, or go upstairs and tell people or beg people to stop practicing so we could like record something for 5 seconds and then be like, go ahead with your scales. But I think a lot of what I got from college really was the people and the connections made with people, like-minded people who I've kept in touch with and work with, and are, you know, are similar in that vein, and we learn from each other. Like there's still people from college that I'll ring up and be like, do you know how to do that? And get help from. So that's the biggest thing.
I also did an English degree, and I think, yeah, it was like having the space to do like to get in a room and make something for the first time, and also I don't think I knew that like theatre director was a job, because it was only ever teachers in secondary school, and then it was like, yeah, finding like-minded people and then kind of moving up as a group was, I think, what it gave to me more than anything I specifically studied on a curriculum or anything.
Great, brilliant. Folks, I think it's 2:10. We have to wind up our event there. That was an absolutely brilliant conversation. I enjoyed talking to you so much today. Thank you very much. And thank you to the audience for coming. It's been fantastic to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.